Welcome to WooEnglish, where we teach English through fascinating stories from history. In today's video, we'll dive into the extraordinary life of Ferdinand Magellan, the man who dared to circumnavigate the globe and forever change the way we see the world. Imagine this: a young boy in Portugal, standing at the edge of the land, gazing out at the endless ocean, dreaming of what lay beyond. That boy would one day lead one of the most daring expeditions in history. You'll follow his incredible journey, from his humble beginnings to the moment he stood at the helm of 5 ships ready to face the unknown. Storms, mutiny, danger at every turn. Yet Magellan's determination never wavered. We'll explore how he battled the seas, faced betrayal, and sailed through uncharted waters with a vision that would change the course of history. His ambition, unstoppable. His courage, unmatched. And though he never lived to see the full fruits of his labor, his legacy sailed on forever. Our goal? To help you improve your English while discovering the inspiring story of a man who truly shaped the world. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to share it, like it, leave a comment, and of course, subscribe for more exciting content. Let's get started. Our goal? To help you improve your English while discovering the inspiring story of a man who truly shaped the world. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to share it, like it, leave a comment, and of course, subscribe for more exciting content. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Spark of Adventure. The wind roared through the narrow streets of Sabrosa, Portugal. It was cold, biting cold, but young Ferdinand Magellan barely noticed. He stood still at the edge of his family's small plot of land. His eyes, wide with wonder, were fixed on the horizon. In the distance, the sun slowly dipped into the sea, casting golden light over the water, and the sky turned shades of red and purple. But the sea, oh, the sea! It stretched out endlessly before him, like a giant mystery waiting to be solved. He had always been fascinated by it. The sea. It whispered to him, calling his name. It was both beautiful and frightening. What lies beyond? Ferdinand often asked himself. Where do the waves go? He could feel his heart racing every time he thought about it. So many questions, questions that no one could answer, not his parents, not his brothers, not anyone in the small village of Sabrosa. The wind picked up, tugging at his worn cloak. It fluttered behind him like a flag, but still Ferdinand didn't move. He was lost in thought, in dreams. His mind swirled with images of distant lands, strange people, and great ships sailing through stormy seas. He pictured himself standing at the helm of a mighty vessel, guiding it through uncharted waters. The thrill of it, the excitement. But then, a shiver ran down his spine. There was fear, too. The unknown was dangerous, wasn't it? His father had always warned him. "The sea is no place for a boy like you, Ferdinand," he would say. "It's full of dangers, pirates, storms, and even worse. You belong here with your family. This is your home." But every time his father said those words, Ferdinand felt something stir inside him. Something wild. Something that couldn't be tamed. Ferdinand loved his family, of course, but deep down he knew he was different. He couldn't be like his brothers, content with farming the land. He needed more. The village was too small for him, too quiet. He needed the sea. He needed adventure. Days passed, but the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if the sea itself was speaking to him, calling to him. When he walked through the village, the merchant's stories caught his ear. Tales of great explorers, of men who had sailed to the ends of the earth, men like Vasco da Gama, who had found a way to India by sea. Ferdinand listened, breathless, as the merchant spoke of gold, spices, and exotic lands. His heart pounded with excitement. That was what he wanted. He wanted to see the world, to discover new places, to find out what lay beyond the horizon. One evening, as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, Ferdinand made a decision. He couldn't ignore the pull of the sea any longer. He knew it would be hard, that his family wouldn't understand. But something deep inside told him that this was his path, his destiny. "I will sail," he whispered to himself. "I will find what no one else has seen. I will discover the unknown." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. But Ferdinand was still young, still inexperienced. How would he do it? Where would he start? These questions weighed on him as he wandered through the village streets. He couldn't just leave. Not yet. He had to learn. He had to prepare. But how? The answer came unexpectedly. It was a quiet evening. Ferdinand was walking back from the marketplace when he heard the sound of hooves on the cobblestone road. A rider, an important one by the looks of his fine clothes, was approaching. Ferdinand moved aside, watching as the man rode past. But then, the rider stopped. He turned, eyeing Ferdinand with curiosity. "You there, boy?" the man called out, his voice sharp. "What is your name?" Ferdinand's heart raced. Who was this man? Why was he talking to him? "Ferdinand," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Ferdinand Magellan." The man smiled, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You have the look of someone who dreams big," he said, his tone softer now. "Tell me, boy, what do you dream of?" Ferdinand hesitated. No one had ever asked him that before, not like this. But something about the man's presence made him speak the truth. "I dream of the sea," Ferdinand said, his voice barely a whisper. "I dream of sailing to places no one has ever seen." The man nodded, as if he already knew. "The sea is a harsh mistress," he said, his voice low and serious. "She tests every man who dares to sail her. But for those who are brave enough, for those who have the courage to face the unknown, she offers rewards beyond imagination." Ferdinand's heart skipped a beat. Could this man see what was inside him? Could he understand the fire that burned in his chest? Do you think I could do it?" Ferdinand asked, his voice trembling with hope. The man smiled again. "If you want it enough, Ferdinand, anything is possible." With that, the rider spurred his horse and disappeared into the night, leaving Ferdinand standing there, breathless. That night, Ferdinand lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with excitement. The man's words echoed in his head over and over. Anything is possible. Yes, he could do it. He would do it. He would find a way to sail. He didn't know how, not yet. But he would learn. He would train. He would do whatever it took. The spark had become a fire. There was no turning back now. As the days passed, Ferdinand threw himself into his studies. He read everything he could about the sea, about navigation, about the stars. He learned about the great explorers who had come before him. He watched the sailors who came to the village port, memorizing every detail. Their ships, their movements, their tools, everything. He worked hard, harder than anyone else his age. He knew his dream wouldn't come easy. He would have to fight for it. But Ferdinand was ready to face the challenges ahead, ready to sail into the unknown. The winds of Sabrosa still howled, as they always did. But now, when Ferdinand stood at the edge of his family's land, looking out at the horizon, he no longer felt fear. Only excitement. Only the thrill of what was to come. Because deep down he knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. In the Shadows of Royalty. Ferdinand Magellan was no longer the curious boy standing at the edge of his family's land. Now he walked through the grand halls of the royal court of King John II of Portugal. The world around him had changed. And yet, deep inside, that spark of adventure still burned. He was surrounded by nobles in fine clothes, by knights in shining armor, by the echoes of important conversations. But in his heart, Ferdinand knew that he didn't quite belong here. The court was alive with activity. Everywhere Ferdinand looked, there were people, men and women, talking, laughing, arguing. It was a place of power, of secrets, of politics. Ferdinand watched and learned. He saw how the king commanded respect. He listened as the nobles discussed alliances and war. He learned the art of diplomacy, how to speak carefully, and how to plan strategies. This was where Ferdinand grew up. But it wasn't where he dreamed of being. Even as he stood among the nobility, Ferdinand's mind wandered. He didn't care for the endless political games. His thoughts drifted, far away from the court, far from the walls of the palace, out to the open sea. The maps hanging on the walls of the royal library called to him. "Look here," they seemed to say, "there is more out there. So much more." He often found himself staring at the large maps of the world. They were old, faded, filled with names of places he had never been. He would run his finger along the lines that showed the edges of the known world. But beyond those lines, there was nothing. Just empty space, unexplored lands, unnamed oceans. Ferdinand's heart would race. What is out there? He would wonder. What have we not yet seen? He had heard the stories, of course, tales of great explorers like Vasco da Gama, who had sailed to India, and Bartolomeo Diaz, who had rounded the Cape of Good Hope. These men were heroes. They had gone where no one else had dared to go. Ferdinand longed to join their ranks, to make his own mark on the world. He wanted to be the one who sailed beyond the known and into the unknown. But how? He was still young, still learning, and the court was not the place for dreamers. The court, though full of grandeur, was also full of dangers. Political tensions were always simmering under the surface. One wrong move, one wrong word, and a person could lose everything. Ferdinand saw it happen to others. He knew he had to be careful, even as he dreamed of faraway lands. The king had many enemies, ambitions clashed, loyalties shifted like the wind. Ferdinand was learning to navigate this treacherous world, but it was not where his heart truly lay. Despite the glittering halls of the palace, Ferdinand often felt trapped. He would watch as knights practiced their swordsmanship, training for battles on land. But Ferdinand didn't want to fight on land. His battles were with the sea. His sword was knowledge. His shield was courage. He spent hours in the royal library, reading every book he could find about navigation, about the stars, about the ocean currents. He absorbed it all like a sponge, knowing that one day, this knowledge would be his key to freedom. One day, Ferdinand found himself standing before the king. The room was heavy with the smell of incense. The king, dressed in royal robes, sat upon his grand throne, surrounded by advisors. Ferdinand bowed low, showing the respect that was expected of him. King John II had been good to him, yes, but there was something Ferdinand wanted more than royal favor. He wanted to explore. The king's deep voice filled the room. "You have learned much, young Ferdinand," he said, his eyes sharp as they rested on the young man. "You have shown promise in both strategy and diplomacy. Your place here is secure." But Ferdinand's heart was not at ease. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, his voice steady, though his heart pounded, "I am honored to serve at your court, but there is more I wish to do, more I wish to see." The king raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" he asked, his voice curious, but also dangerous. "And what is it that you wish to see, young Magellan?" Ferdinand swallowed. This was his moment. "The world, Your Majesty," he said, his voice stronger now. "I wish to sail, to explore, to go where others have not yet gone." There was a long silence in the room. The advisors exchanged nervous glances. Ferdinand could feel the weight of the king's gaze on him, but he did not falter. He stood tall, his heart racing, waiting for the king's response. Finally, the king smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You are bold, Ferdinand," he said softly. "But boldness alone is not enough. The sea is not kind. It swallows men whole. Many have tried and many have failed. Why should you succeed where others have not?" Ferdinand met the king's gaze, his eyes shining with determination. "Because, Your Majesty," he said, "I will not stop until I do." The king's smile grew wider. He liked this answer, but he said nothing more. He simply waved his hand, dismissing Ferdinand from his presence. As Ferdinand left the throne room, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride for standing his ground, but also frustration. The king had not given him permission. He was still stuck in the court, learning the ways of the nobility, surrounded by politics and power. But deep inside, he knew his time would come. The maps, the stories, the call of the sea, they wouldn't leave him alone. They whispered to him every day, urging him to act, urging him to take a chance. But how could he, when the king's eyes were always watching? When the weight of the court's expectations hung heavy on his shoulders? Ferdinand knew that he couldn't stay in the shadows forever. He couldn't remain a student of strategy and war while his heart longed for adventure. The sea called him louder and louder each day. He had learned much from the court, yes, but his real lessons would come from the ocean, from the unknown. And so, as he looked at the stars one clear night, Ferdinand made a promise to himself. "I will find a way," he whispered into the darkness. "I will sail, and I will discover what lies beyond." The court of King John II could only hold him for so long. His destiny was not in the royal halls. It was out there, beyond the horizon, where the maps ended and the adventure began. Chapter 3. The Sea Beckons. The day had finally come. Ferdinand Magellan stood at the edge of the dock, his heart pounding in his chest. Before him lay a ship, its sails ready to catch the wind, its wooden deck gleaming under the sun. The sea stretched out beyond, endless and inviting, its waves gently lapping against the shore. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when his dream would become reality. The crew bustled around him, preparing for the voyage. The sound of ropes being pulled, the clanking of metal, and the shouts of sailors filled the air. But all Ferdinand could hear was the call of the sea, louder than ever before. It was no longer just a distant voice in his mind. Now, it was real, tangible. He could see it, feel it, smell it. The salty breeze whipped through his hair, carrying with it the promise of adventure. His heart raced as he took his first steps onto the ship. The wooden planks creaked beneath his feet, the scent of salt water and tar thick in the air. He stood still for a moment, letting the feeling wash over him. This was where he belonged. Not in the grand halls of a royal court, but here, on the deck of a ship, with the wind in his face and the open sea before him. The captain's voice boomed from the helm. "All hands ready, we set sail!" The crew sprang into action. Ropes were pulled, sails were unfurled, and slowly the ship began to move. Ferdinand's heart leapt as the dock slipped away and the ship glided out into the open water. The gentle rocking of the boat under his feet, the sound of the waves crashing against the hull. It was exhilarating. His dream was no longer just a dream. He was sailing. He was free. As the ship cut through the waves, Ferdinand couldn't tear his eyes away from the horizon. The sky stretched out endlessly before him, the clouds drifting lazily above the water. He had heard so many stories about the sea, its dangers, its beauty, its power. But now, he was seeing it with his own eyes. The sea was alive. It breathed, it moved, it whispered secrets that only those brave enough to sail its waters could hear. The wind picked up, filling the sails and pushing the ship forward. Ferdinand stood at the bow, the salty spray of the ocean cooling his face. His heart beat fast. His hands gripped the wooden railing. This was where he was meant to be. The court. It feels like another world, he thought. He had spent so many years learning the ways of nobility, studying war and politics, but none of that compared to this moment. The vast ocean stretched before him, full of mystery, full of promise. And he, Ferdinand Magellan, was ready to explore it. The days passed, and Ferdinand quickly became part of the crew. He worked side by side with the sailors, learning the ropes, literally. He hauled sails, tied knots, scrubbed the deck. It was hard work, but Ferdinand didn't mind. Every task, every moment on that ship brought him closer to the thing he craved most: discovery. At night, the sea transformed. The sun would sink below the horizon, leaving behind a sky full of stars. Ferdinand would stand on deck, gazing up at the heavens. The stars glittered like diamonds, their light reflected on the dark surface of the water. They seemed so close, as if he could reach out and touch them. The sailors would often use the stars to navigate, and Ferdinand listened carefully as they explained their secrets. The stars, the wind, the currents, they were all part of the same story, a story that Ferdinand was eager to write. But the sea was not always kind. There were days when the winds died down, leaving the ship stranded in still waters. The heat would beat down mercilessly, and the crew would grow restless. Food and water began to run low. The excitement that had filled the ship at the beginning of the voyage started to fade. Doubts crept into the minds of the men. How long would this journey last? They wondered. What if they never reached their destination? Ferdinand felt those doubts too, deep in his chest, but he refused to give in to them. I came here for a reason, he reminded himself. This is where I belong. The stillness of the sea was just another challenge, another test of his determination. He stood tall, watching the horizon, waiting for the wind to return. And when it did, when the sails filled once more and the ship surged forward, Ferdinand's heart soared. This was what he had been waiting for. The adventure continued. But then, there were the storms. Dark clouds would gather on the horizon, thick and menacing. The sea, once calm, would grow wild and angry. Waves taller than a man would crash against the ship, tossing it from side to side. The wind howled, pulling at the sails, threatening to tear them apart. The rain poured down in sheets, soaking everything. The crew scrambled to keep control of the ship, their shouts barely heard over the roar of the storm. Ferdinand held on tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. The sea was testing them, pushing them to their limits, but he didn't feel fear. No, he felt alive. The power of the storm, the fury of the sea, it only fueled his desire to keep going, to push further. This is what it means to be an explorer, he thought, to face the unknown no matter the cost. When the storm finally passed, leaving the sea calm once more, Ferdinand stood at the bow of the ship, looking out at the endless blue. He was tired, his muscles ached, but his spirit was stronger than ever. The storm had shown him something important, that the sea, with all its beauty and danger, was where he truly belonged. He was not meant for the safety of the court or the comforts of home. His destiny was out here, on the waves, facing whatever the sea threw at him. As the sun rose on another day, Ferdinand took a deep breath of the salty air. Every sail that unfurled, every star that appeared in the night sky, reminded him of why he was here. His dreams of exploration, of discovering new lands, were no longer just dreams. They were real, and he, Ferdinand Magellan, was ready to sail further than anyone had before. His journey had only just begun. Chapter 4. Betrayal and Exile. The sea had once been Ferdinand's greatest ally. It gave him freedom, adventure, and the promise of a future filled with discovery. But now, as he walked through the dark, cold halls of the royal palace, the sea felt far away. The whispers had started, quiet at first, but soon, like wildfire, they spread. Doubt, betrayal. His loyalty to the King of Portugal was being questioned. Ferdinand had served the king faithfully for years. He had fought in battles, sailed on dangerous missions, and given his best. But somehow, it wasn't enough. Rumors swirled around him like a thick fog. He's only loyal to himself, they said. He wants too much power. These words hurt more than any wound from a sword. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with confusion. Why? Why would they turn against him? The court that had once been his home now felt like a prison. Every glance, every whispered conversation felt like a dagger aimed at his back. Ferdinand's friends began to distance themselves. The nobles who had once welcomed him with open arms now looked at him with suspicion. The air was thick with tension, and soon the king, once his greatest supporter, began to listen to the rumors. "Ferdinand, you have grown too ambitious," the king said one day, his voice cold. They were standing in the grand hall, the light from the windows casting long shadows on the floor. Ferdinand's heart sank as he realized what was happening. "I have served you with all my heart," Ferdinand replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Everything I've done has been for Portugal." But the king's face remained hard. "I cannot trust you," he said simply. The words hit Ferdinand like a punch to the gut. Trust. The one thing he had always valued. The one thing he thought he had earned. Now it was gone. And then came the final blow. Exile. Ferdinand Magellan, once a favored courtier, once a trusted soldier of the crown, was cast aside. He was no longer welcome in the court, no longer trusted, no longer wanted. The king, with a simple wave of his hand, had ended Ferdinand's dreams, or so it seemed. Ferdinand left the palace in silence. His steps were slow, heavy. The world around him seemed darker, colder. The wind blew through the streets, carrying the sound of distant laughter. He clenched his fists. His heart burned with a mix of anger and sorrow. How could this happen? How could everything fall apart so quickly? He had given so much, and now he had nothing. Days passed, but the pain didn't fade. Ferdinand wandered the streets of Lisbon, a city that once felt like home but now seemed foreign. The whispers followed him everywhere. "Traitor," they said. "Ambitious fool." Ferdinand tried to ignore them, but they cut deep. He found himself by the docks, watching the ships sail in and out of the harbor. His heart ached as he watched the sailors laugh and work together, their faces full of hope and excitement. Once he had been like them. Once the sea had been his escape. But now it felt like everything was slipping away. For a while, Ferdinand considered giving up. What was left for him? He had no place in the court, no support from the king. His dream of exploration seemed impossible now. He was a man without a country, without a mission. But deep down, Ferdinand knew that this wasn't the end. No, something inside him refused to let go. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. He had come too far, sacrificed too much. The sea still called to him even now. Even in his darkest moment, he could still hear its whisper. "Come back," it seemed to say. "There's more to discover." And then, an idea began to form. Portugal had turned its back on him. But Portugal wasn't the only country in the world. There were other kings, other lands, other opportunities. If one door had closed, maybe another could open. The fire inside Ferdinand, once dim, began to burn again. He wasn't done. Not yet. Spain. Yes, Spain. It was a bold thought, a risky one. But boldness had always been part of who Ferdinand was. Spain was Portugal's rival. They too were searching for new routes to the east, for a way to the Spice Islands. Ferdinand knew this. And maybe, just maybe, they would see his potential, his vision, in a way that Portugal no longer could. The decision wasn't easy. It meant leaving behind everything he knew, his home, his family, his past. But what choice did he have? Ferdinand had never been one to back down from a challenge. He wasn't going to start now. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ferdinand set off for Spain. The road was long, filled with uncertainty, but each step he took was one step closer to a new beginning. The whispers of betrayal faded into the distance, replaced by the call of the unknown. He was leaving behind the shadows of doubt and walking into the light of possibility. Exile was not the end. No, it was only the beginning. As he crossed the border into Spain, Ferdinand felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but it no longer controlled him. He was free now, free to chase his dreams, free to follow his heart. The sea was waiting for him, and Ferdinand Magellan was ready to answer its call. Chapter 5. A New Hope, a New King. Spain. A New Land, a New Start. As Ferdinand Magellan crossed the border into this foreign country, the air felt different, lighter. His past in Portugal was behind him. All the whispers of betrayal, all the rejection, all the pain, he left it in the shadows. Before him lay new possibilities. Here, in Spain, his dream still had a chance, and he would not let it slip away. The Spanish court was a place of grandeur. Gold-trimmed walls, vast halls filled with chatter, and a young king, Charles I, who had just come to power. Ferdinand could feel the excitement in the air. The king was ambitious, eager to make his mark on the world. This was exactly what Ferdinand needed. He had traveled a long, uncertain road to get here. Now he stood at the edge of a new chapter. But would the king listen? Would he believe in Ferdinand's vision? Days passed, and Ferdinand prepared his plan. He pored over maps, studied routes, and practiced the words he would say. His idea was bold. He wanted to sail west, across the Atlantic, to reach the Spice Islands, the source of riches and treasures. Most believed this was impossible. They thought the world ended in vast, empty oceans. But Ferdinand knew better. He had studied the stars, the winds, the sea. He had a plan, and he was determined to make it real. The day finally came. Ferdinand stood before King Charles I. His heart raced. This was the moment. The grand throne room was filled with advisors, noblemen, and merchants, all waiting to hear what the Portuguese exile had to say. Ferdinand could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others doubtful. But he stood tall, his hands steady, his voice calm. "Your Majesty," Ferdinand began, bowing deeply before the young king, "I come to you with a vision of discovery, of glory, and of great wealth for Spain." His words hung in the air, and the room fell silent. All eyes were on him. Charles I, no older than 20, sat on his grand throne, his sharp eyes fixed on Ferdinand. He was quiet, listening carefully. Ferdinand continued, his voice filled with passion. "The Spice Islands, Your Majesty. The richest islands in the world. They lie far to the east, but I propose we sail west." A murmur rippled through the room. Sail west? That had never been done before. Ferdinand kept going. "If we sail west across the Atlantic and find a passage, we will open a new route to the Spice Islands, one that will make Spain the greatest power in the world. It is a daring plan, yes, but I believe it can be done." The room was tense. Some of the king's advisers whispered to each other, shaking their heads in doubt. But Ferdinand stood firm. He could see it in his mind. The ships, the open ocean, the discovery of lands no one had ever seen. He wasn't just dreaming. He was sure. King Charles leaned forward, his face thoughtful. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence in the room was heavy. Ferdinand's heart pounded in his chest. He had given everything to get to this point. If the king said no, it would all be over. But then Charles spoke. His voice was calm, measured. "You are asking for much, Magellan," he said, "but you offer much in return." Ferdinand held his breath. The king's eyes narrowed as he considered the bold plan. "What makes you so certain you can succeed where others have failed?" Ferdinand met the king's gaze, his voice steady and confident. "Because I will not stop, Your Majesty. I will sail until I find that passage. I will not fail." The king studied Ferdinand for a moment longer. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, but it was enough. "Very well," Charles said, leaning back in his throne. "I will back your expedition. You will have your ships, and you will sail west." A wave of relief and excitement washed over Ferdinand. He could hardly believe it. His dream was alive again. The king had said yes. The room buzzed with surprise and discussion, but Ferdinand's mind was racing with thoughts of the journey ahead. As Ferdinand left the court that day, his heart was full. He had done it. Spain would give him the ships, the crew, the support he needed. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead. Storms, danger, maybe even death. But Ferdinand Magellan was not afraid. His dream was worth it. In the weeks that followed, Ferdinand worked tirelessly to prepare for the voyage. He oversaw the building of the ships, 5 sturdy vessels that would carry him across the ocean: the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Conception, the Victoria, and the Santiago. Each day, as the ships neared completion, Ferdinand could feel the excitement building inside him. Soon they would be ready. Soon they would set sail. But there were also doubts. Some of the crew whispered behind his back. "What if he's wrong?" they said. "What if we sail into nothing?" Others feared the long journey, the dangers of the unknown sea. But Ferdinand stood firm. He knew the risks. He knew the fears. But he also knew what lay beyond those fears: discovery, glory, victory. The day of departure finally arrived. The port was alive with activity. Sailors shouted, loading supplies onto the ships. The masts stood tall, the sails ready to catch the wind. Ferdinand walked along the dock, his heart racing with excitement. The journey he had dreamed of for so long was about to begin. As he stood on the deck of the Trinidad, his flagship, Ferdinand looked out at the sea. The horizon stretched endlessly before him. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the passage he sought, the passage that would make history. The wind picked up, filling the sails. the ships began to move. Slowly, they pulled away from the dock, the land slipping into the distance. Ferdinand felt a surge of emotion, relief, joy, and a deep sense of purpose. He had faced betrayal, exile, and doubt. But now, his dream was alive again. The sea was calling him once more, and this time he would answer with all his heart. As the fleet sailed west, Ferdinand Magellan stood at the bow of his ship, the wind in his hair, the waves crashing against the hull. The adventure of a lifetime had begun, and nothing, no storm, no challenge, no fear would stop him now. Chapter 6. The Fleet of Destiny. 5 ships, just 5. Ferdinand Magellan stood at the helm of his flagship, the Trinidad. His eyes scanned the horizon, his heart pounding in his chest. Before him, the other ships, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago, stood tall in the harbor, their sails ready to catch the wind. The masts creaked, the ropes strained, and the air was thick with the smell of salt and the promise of adventure. This was it, the journey of a lifetime, the expedition that would change everything. Magellan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was now Captain General, the leader of this fleet, trusted by the King of Spain to find a new route to the Spice Islands. But more than that, he was a man on a mission that had consumed him for years. His gaze moved over his crew, bustling about on deck. Some were excited, eager for the voyage ahead. Others were nervous, afraid. Magellan could see it in their eyes, the fear of the unknown. They had heard stories of the dangers that awaited them, treacherous seas, fierce storms, and the endless empty ocean. Some wondered if they would ever return. But Magellan? He had no such doubts. His focus was clear, his determination unshakable. He had waited too long, fought too hard, to let fear stop him now. The ships rocked gently in the harbor as they waited for the signal to depart. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the water. Magellan took a deep breath, tasting the salty air. It was a moment he had dreamed of for years, standing at the helm of a great ship, leading a fleet into the unknown. He had imagined it so many times, but now it was real. The journey ahead was filled with uncertainty. Magellan knew that, but he also knew that this was his destiny. "We sail west," he had told the King of Spain, "and we will find a new way to the Spice Islands." Many had doubted him. Some had even laughed at his plan. But Magellan didn't care. He knew deep in his heart that he was right. And now he would prove it. The harbor was alive with activity. Sailors shouted orders, pulling on ropes, securing supplies, making final preparations for the long voyage ahead. The sound of hammers echoed as the last crates of food and water were loaded onto the ships. Every detail had to be perfect. Every man had a role to play. Magellan's heart raced as he thought about the dangers they would face. The vast ocean stretched out before them, uncharted, unknown, full of mystery and peril. They would face storms, hunger, maybe even mutiny. But none of that mattered now. There was only one goal: to succeed. Failure was not an option. Magellan's thoughts were interrupted by a shout from the lookout. "Captain, the wind is shifting!" He turned his eyes to the horizon. The breeze had picked up, rippling the water and causing the sails to billow. It was time. Time to leave the safety of the harbor and sail into the vast, endless ocean. Magellan's voice rang out across the deck. "Prepare to set sail!" His crew jumped into action, their hands moving quickly, tightening ropes, securing the sails. The ship groaned as it began to move, slowly at first, but soon picking up speed. The other ships followed close behind, their sails catching the wind, pushing them forward. As the land behind them began to fade, Magellan stood at the helm, his grip firm on the wheel. The city of Seville, with its noise and crowds, was disappearing into the distance. Soon, there would be nothing but open sea, and the unknown. His heart thudded in his chest. This was what he had been waiting for. The uncertainty, the danger, the thrill of exploration. He could feel it in his bones. Every wave that crashed against the hull, every gust of wind that pushed the sails forward, fueled his desire to go further, to push beyond what anyone thought was possible. The sea stretched out endlessly before them, vast and blue. The ships moved swiftly, cutting through the water like arrows. The crew worked together, their movements smooth and practiced. But beneath their calm actions, Magellan could sense the tension. This was not an ordinary journey. This was something far greater. For many of the men, this was their first time venturing so far from home. They whispered among themselves, wondering how long it would be before they saw land again. Days? Weeks? Months? No one knew. And that uncertainty weighed heavily on them. Magellan, however, remained calm. He had prepared for this. He had studied the maps, charted the stars, and learned everything he could about navigation. He knew the risks. He knew the dangers. But he also knew that greatness required courage. And he had courage to spare. Night fell, and the stars appeared in the sky, twinkling like diamonds. Magellan stood on the deck, staring up at the heavens. The stars were his guide. They would lead him to where he needed to go. He had learned their secrets, how they moved, how they pointed the way. As long as he had the stars, he knew he would find the passage he sought. The crew moved quietly around him, their footsteps soft on the wooden deck. Some of them looked up at the stars too, their faces filled with awe. The night was peaceful, the sea calm. But Magellan knew this peace would not last. The sea had a way of testing those who dared to challenge it. The fleet sailed on, 5 ships cutting through the water, their sails full of wind, their crews full of hope and fear. Magellan could feel both in the air, the hope of discovery, the fear of the unknown. But as Captain General, it was his job to lead, to inspire, to show them that this journey, no matter how dangerous, was worth it. "Stay the course," Magellan whispered to himself, gripping the wheel tightly. "We will succeed." The wind continued to blow, the waves crashed gently against the ships, and the stars shone brightly above. The fleet of destiny sailed westward, into the unknown, into history. Chapter 7. Through the Unknown. Weeks turned into months. The endless stretch of the sea seemed to go on forever. No land in sight, no comfort from the horizon, just water, and more water. For Ferdinand Magellan and his crew, the ocean had become both their path and their prison. The once hopeful departure had now turned into a brutal test of endurance. Each day, the men grew quieter. Their faces, once full of excitement, were now lined with exhaustion and fear. Supplies dwindled, food was running out, and the water, stale and foul, barely kept them alive. The endless blue of the ocean offered no comfort. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, and the cold winds chilled them at night. But worse than the physical hardships was the uncertainty. How much longer would this journey last? Where were they headed? Would they ever see land again? The crew's morale plummeted. Whispered conversations filled the night air. "Maybe the captain is wrong," some said. "Maybe we're lost." The sailors' trust in Magellan began to waver. They had followed him, believed in his vision, But now they were afraid. Storms battered the fleet, powerful and wild. Huge waves crashed against the ships, tossing them about like toys in the hands of an angry sea. The wind howled, the sails ripped, and the masts groaned under the force of the storms. Men clung to the rails, their knuckles white with fear. Some prayed, others cursed. It felt like the sea itself was trying to swallow them whole. Through it all, Ferdinand Magellan stood strong. As the storm raged around them, he stood at the helm of the Trinidad, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind whipped through his hair, the rain stung his skin, but his gaze never faltered. His hands gripped the wheel tightly. He knew the men were scared. He knew they had doubts, but he also knew something else. There was a way. He could feel it. He had studied the stars, the winds, the currents. He had prepared for this. "We will find the passage," he whispered to himself. "We must." When the storm finally passed and the sea calmed, the men were left in a state of shock, exhausted, soaked, and shaken. But they were alive. Magellan called them to the deck, his voice firm, commanding. "Listen to me," he began, looking each man in the eye. His tone was steady, strong. "We knew this journey would be difficult. We knew there would be challenges, but we are not turning back. We will find the way forward, I promise you." The men looked at him, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. They wanted to believe him. They needed to believe him. But how much longer could they hold on? As the days passed, tensions rose. Men began to whisper of mutiny. Some believed they had sailed too far, that the captain had led them into a trap. The fear of the unknown gnawed at their minds. The open ocean, with its vast emptiness, played tricks on their thoughts. "Why should we follow him any longer?" one sailor murmured to another. "Maybe we should take control." But Magellan sensed the unrest brewing. He had been a soldier, a courtier. He understood human nature. He knew that fear could turn even the most loyal men against their leader, so he acted swiftly. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a red glow over the sea, Magellan called his officers to the Trinidad's deck. His voice was calm, but there was steel in his words. "I know what you're thinking," he said, looking each one of them in the eye. "You doubt me. You think we're lost. But I tell you this, we are closer than you think." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Do not give in to fear. Fear will destroy us. Fear will make us weak." He stepped forward, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I have studied these waters. I know the way. There is a passage ahead, and we will find it. But I need you with me, all of you." The officers exchanged nervous glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, but Magellan's presence was undeniable. His confidence, his determination, it was impossible to ignore. "Keep faith," he told them, his voice quieter now but filled with conviction. "There is a way." For a moment, there was silence. Then, one by one, the officers nodded. They would follow him, at least for now. They would put their trust in him, despite the fear gnawing at their hearts. Magellan had won them over. Again. The days stretched on, the sea stretching endlessly before them. The supplies were running dangerously low now. The men grew weaker, thinner, their faces pale, their bodies worn down by the harsh conditions. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Some became sick, too weak to work. The sight of empty barrels and rotting food made their hearts sink. But Magellan's will was unbreakable. No matter the hardships, no matter the storms or the threats of mutiny, Ferdinand Magellan remained steadfast. He was their captain, their leader, and he would see them through this. He spent his days on deck, guiding the ship, watching the horizon. At night, when the stars appeared in the sky, he studied them carefully, plotting their course. his mind never wavered. He knew that they were close. He had to believe it. And slowly, that belief began to spread through the crew. They saw their captain's strength, his unshakable faith in their mission, and it gave them strength too. If Magellan can keep going, they thought, so can we. The unknown waters ahead were terrifying, but they pressed on. The fleet, though battered and weakened, sailed through the vast ocean, guided by their captain's unwavering hand. The journey was far from over, but the men, though exhausted and afraid, began to trust again. They followed their captain, trusting that somehow, some way, they would reach their destination. Chapter 8. The Wrath of the Sea. The Magellan Strait, a narrow, twisting passage that lay between two mighty oceans. It was a gateway, a place of danger, a place where the sea showed its true power. Ferdinand Magellan and his crew had finally reached it. After months of sailing through the unknown, facing hunger, fear, and doubt, this was the moment they had been waiting for. But no one could have prepared them for what lay ahead. The wind howled through the strait, sharp and unforgiving. Dark clouds gathered above, turning the sky into a swirling storm of black and gray. The waters churned violently beneath the ships. Waves crashed against the hulls, sending sprays of cold, salty water over the decks. The men clung to the ropes, their faces pale, their hands trembling. They had never seen the sea so angry. Magellan stood at the helm of the Trinidad, his eyes fixed on the narrow channel ahead. His jaw was set, his hands steady on the wheel. This was the path they had to take. There was no other way. The strait was their only hope of reaching the Pacific, but it was also a place of danger, where ships could be torn apart by the sea's fury. "Hold fast!" Magellan shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "Stay strong!" The men scrambled to follow his orders, pulling on ropes, securing the sails, trying to keep control of the ship. But the sea was relentless. The waves grew higher, towering above them like walls of water, crashing down with terrifying force. One by one, the ships entered the strait. The San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago followed behind the Trinidad, each one battling the storm with everything they had. The wind screamed through the rigging, and the ships groaned under the pressure. Suddenly, a great wave struck the side of the Santiago. The ship lurched violently, the men on deck losing their footing. Ropes snapped, sails tore, and before anyone could react, the ship was thrown into the rocks. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the storm. The Santiago was lost. Magellan watched in horror as the ship disappeared beneath the waves. Men screamed, their voices lost in the chaos of the storm. The crew of the Trinidad stared in shock, but there was no time to mourn. The sea was still raging, and they had to keep moving. "Steady!" Magellan called out, his voice unwavering. "We must keep going." The wind roared in response, pushing the ships further into the strait. The waters were wild and unpredictable, swirling around them, pulling them in every direction. The men fought with everything they had, their muscles aching, their bodies drenched in icy water. But through it all, Magellan stood tall. His eyes never left the horizon. He knew they had to push forward. There was no turning back now. The hours dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The storm showed no sign of stopping. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the terrifying scene below. The ships were tossed about like toys in the hands of an angry sea, and the men's fears reached their peak. Would they survive this? Would they ever see the calm waters of the Pacific? Magellan's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let fear control him. He had faced too many challenges to give up now. The strait was treacherous, yes, but it was also the final barrier between them and their goal. If they could survive this, if they could make it through these deadly waters, the Pacific would be theirs. "Hold on!" Magellan shouted once more, his voice filled with determination. The men clung to the ship, their knuckles white, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. But they held on. They followed their captain, even as the sea tried to tear them apart. Then, just as it seemed like the storm would never end, the first light of dawn broke through the clouds. Slowly, the winds began to calm. The waves, once towering and fierce, began to settle. The sky, still heavy with dark clouds, started to clear, revealing the faint glow of the sun on the horizon. Magellan looked ahead, his heart swelling with hope. They had made it. The ships, battered and broken, had survived the storm. But more importantly, they had made it through the strait. The narrow passage was behind them now, and as the sun rose higher in the sky, it revealed something that took their breath away. A vast, calm ocean stretched out before them. The waters were smooth, almost like glass, shining under the morning light. It was a scene so peaceful, so beautiful, that for a moment, the men forgot their fear, their exhaustion, and their loss. They stood in awe, gazing out at the endless blue expanse that lay before them. Magellan stepped forward, his eyes scanning the calm waters. He had never seen an ocean like this before. After all the storms, after all the dangers, this new ocean seemed to offer them peace. He turned to his men, a small smile playing on his lips. "We will call it the Pacific," he said softly, "for its peace." The men nodded, still too stunned to speak. The Pacific, a name fitting for such a calm, quiet ocean. But even as the crew began to relax, to feel the relief of survival, Magellan knew that their journey was far from over. This ocean, peaceful as it seemed, held its own secrets, its own challenges. The Spice Islands were still far away. They had much more to endure before they reached their destination. But for now, they had made it through the hardest part. They had survived the wrath of the sea. As the ship sailed into the Pacific, Ferdinand Magellan stood at the helm, his heart filled with both relief and determination. The journey was not over, but they were one step closer to their goal. He had led his men through the unknown, through the most dangerous waters they had ever seen. And now they sailed toward the promise of discovery and history. Chapter 9. Land of Promise, Land of Danger. The Pacific had been kinder to them than the storms of the strait. Weeks passed, and the ocean remained calm, almost too calm. The fleet moved steadily forward, the wind filling their sails, the sky bright and clear. The men's spirits, worn down by the endless trials of the journey, began to rise again. Hope was rekindled with each passing day. After all they had endured, they were closer now, closer than ever. One morning, a cry rang out from the crow's nest. "Land! Land ahead!" The crew rushed to the side of the ship, eyes wide, searching the horizon. And there it was, faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. A chain of islands, green, lush, and full of life. Magellan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the land they had dreamed of, the islands rich with spices, the very treasure they had sought for so long. A wave of excitement swept through the men. They had made it. After months of hardship, suffering, and endless ocean, they were about to reach the lands that promised wealth beyond their wildest dreams. The crew buzzed with anticipation, talking of the spices they would bring back to Spain, the riches that awaited them. Magellan stood at the helm of the Trinidad, his eyes locked on the distant shore. His mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. He believed this land would change everything. The King of Spain would see the value of his journey, the rewards of his vision. He had led them through the unknown, and now they would reap the rewards. As they approached the islands, the air became thick with the scent of tropical flowers. The sound of waves gently lapping against the sandy shores filled the air. Birds flew overhead, their bright colors vivid against the blue sky. It was paradise. The men, exhausted and thin from months at sea, looked at the land with eager eyes. But even in this moment of joy, Magellan's mind was sharp. He knew that new lands brought new challenges. The people of these islands would be unknown, their customs unfamiliar. But he believed, no. He knew he could forge alliances here. The islanders would welcome them, trade with them. They had to. "Prepare the landing party," Magellan ordered, his voice filled with authority and confidence. The men quickly obeyed, lowering the small boats into the water. Excitement mixed with nerves as the crew prepared to set foot on land for the first time in months. But Magellan? He was calm. He had a mission, a plan. He would succeed. As the landing boats approached the shore, Magellan studied the islanders who gathered to watch them. They stood at the edge of the beach, curious, silent, their eyes fixed on the approaching foreigners. Magellan raised a hand in greeting, offering a smile. "We come in peace," he whispered to himself. "We come to trade." The small boats landed, and Magellan and his men stepped onto the warm, sandy beach. The islanders, dressed in brightly colored cloths, stood before them, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, there was silence, the two groups simply staring at each other. Then, slowly, one of the islanders stepped forward, offering what looked like a piece of fruit. Magellan took it with a nod, his heart racing with hope. It was a sign of peace, a sign that they could work together. Days passed, and Magellan's confidence grew. The islanders seemed friendly, welcoming. They traded goods, spices, fruit, and valuable items in exchange for tools and metal from the ships. The crew, once weary and starving, now feasted on fresh food, their spirits lifted by the warm hospitality of the islanders. It seemed as though everything was falling into place. Magellan was sure of it. "This is the land we've been searching for," Magellan told his officers one evening as they sat around a fire on the beach. "The King of Spain will reward us greatly. We will return as heroes." His eyes gleamed with ambition. His confidence was unshakable. He had led them to the land of promise, and he believed that nothing could go wrong now. But Magellan's ambition, his confidence, blinded him to the dangers that were quietly gathering around them. Some of the islanders were not as friendly as they seemed. Whispers spread among them, whispers of distrust, of fear. Who were these men who had come from across the ocean? What did they really want? And why did they stay so long? The tension began to grow, slowly at first, then faster, like the buildup of a storm on the horizon. Magellan, confident in his ability to lead, did not see the danger for what it was. He believed he could control the situation, that his power and authority would protect him. He met with local chiefs, offering gifts and promises of friendship. He believed these alliances were secure. But not everyone agreed. One morning, the tension finally snapped. A group of islanders armed with spears and anger in their eyes confronted Magellan's men on the beach. Voices were raised, tempers flared, and soon the peaceful calm of the island shattered. Shouts echoed across the sand. The men of the Trinidad scrambled to their feet, unsure of what to do. This was not the welcome they had expected. Magellan, hearing the commotion, rushed to the scene. His heart pounded as he saw the islanders, their spears raised, their faces fierce. But even then, he believed he could control it. He stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We do not mean harm," he called out. "We are friends." But his words fell on deaf ears. The islanders, tired of the foreign presence, saw Magellan and his men as invaders, not allies. In their eyes, the strangers had stayed too long, taken too much. A spear flew through the air. Chaos erupted. Magellan's men scrambled for their weapons, but they were outnumbered. The islanders, fierce and skilled, charged forward, and the beach became a battlefield. Shouts, the clash of metal, the sound of bodies hitting the sand. It was a nightmare. Through it all, Magellan fought with everything he had. He was a soldier, after all, a man who had faced danger many times before. But this time was different. The battle was swift, brutal, and by the time it was over, the sand was stained with blood. Magellan, the man who had led them across the world, lay still on the beach. The islanders had won. The dream, the ambition, had come crashing down. The land of promise had become a land of danger. And for Ferdinand Magellan, the journey was over. But for his men, the voyage had not yet ended. They would have to continue without him to finish what he had started. Chapter 10. The Final Battle. The island of Mactan lay before them, calm and peaceful under the morning sun. But Ferdinand Magellan knew that today would bring anything but peace. He stood on the beach, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, eyes fixed on the distant figures of the island's warriors. Today he would lead his men into battle. Magellan, ever the leader, believed in his mission. He believed that he could unite the people of these islands, bring them under the protection of Spain. He had done it before with other tribes, and now, he thought, he could do it again. But this time, he was wrong. He had been warned that the people of Mactan were different, fierce, proud. They would not bow easily. But Magellan's confidence was unshakable. He had crossed oceans, survived storms, and faced dangers unimaginable. Surely, he thought, this small battle would be no different. The men stood ready, swords and shields in hand, their faces tight with nerves. There were only 50 of them, 50 against an entire island, but Magellan believed in victory. He had to. "Stay close," he told his men, his voice steady. "We can end this quickly. Show them we mean business, and they will surrender." His words were filled with authority, but behind them there was a hint of desperation. He needed this victory. He needed to prove that his journey, his dream, had not been in vain. The waves lapped gently at the shore as Magellan and his small force waded through the shallow waters, heading toward the warriors of Mactan who waited on the beach. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on their backs, the heat already unbearable. As they neared the shore, the first spear flew. It came from the islanders, swift and deadly, slicing through the air before striking one of Magellan's men. The soldier fell, his cry lost in the roar of battle that suddenly erupted around them. Magellan's heart raced. He drew his sword, his eyes narrowing as he charged forward. "Attack!" he shouted. His men followed, rushing toward the islanders, but the battle quickly turned into chaos. The warriors of Mactan, barefoot and armed with simple weapons, fought with a strength and skill Magellan had not anticipated. They moved swiftly, dodging the heavy blows of the Spaniards, striking with precision. Magellan swung his sword, the blade cutting through the air. He fought with all the strength he had, blocking blows, slashing at his enemies. But for every warrior he struck down, 2 more seemed to take their place. The islanders fought with a fierceness he had never seen before. They were not like the others. They would not back down. Around him, his men were falling. One by one, they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of warriors. The beach was a blur of movement, swords clashing, spears flying, men shouting in pain. The tide had turned against them. Magellan's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to rally his men, shouting orders that were barely heard over the din of battle. But it was no use. The warriors of Mactan were too strong, too fast. His small force was being wiped out. A sharp pain shot through Magellan's leg as a spear struck him, knocking him to the ground. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. But the islanders were closing in, their eyes filled with determination. They would not stop until the last Spaniard had fallen. Magellan raised his sword, preparing for another attack, but his movements were slower now. His strength was fading. Another blow hit him, this time on his arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. He stumbled, the world around him spinning. The sounds of the battle grew distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. He fell to his knees. The beach, once bright and full of life, was now stained with blood. His men, the men he had led across the world, lay motionless in the sand. The islanders moved toward him, their faces unreadable, their victory certain. Magellan's vision blurred. His body ached. He knew this was the end. The waves of the Pacific lapped gently at the shore as if mocking the chaos that had just unfolded. The ocean, calm and peaceful, stretched out before him, but Ferdinand Magellan, he would not see it again. His thoughts raced. He had dreamed of conquering the seas, of finding new lands, of bringing glory to Spain. He had dreamed of success, of riches, of a legacy that would last forever. And now it was slipping away. This was not how it was supposed to end. He had faced so much, fought so hard, and now, here on this small island, he would take his final breath. His body trembled, weakened by the battle, by the wounds that covered him. The world around him began to fade, the sounds of the ocean mixing with the cries of the dying. His vision darkened, but his mind remained sharp, even in his final moments. He had led them across the world. He had survived the wrath of the sea. He had faced the unknown and embraced it. But even the greatest leaders fall. As the islanders closed in, Magellan's thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought him here. The men he had commanded, the seas he had sailed, the lands he had seen. He had accomplished so much, and yet there was still so much left undone. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the beach. The air grew cooler, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of the ocean. And there, as the waves of the Pacific gently lapped at the shore, Ferdinand Magellan, the man who had dreamed of conquering the seas, took his final breath. His journey had come to an end, but his legacy would live on. Chapter 11. The World Moves On. Though Ferdinand Magellan fell on the shores of Mactan, his dream did not die with him. The journey, his great mission to sail around the world, was far from over. The men he had led, broken and battered by the battle, still had a path ahead of them. The ocean called to them, and one ship, Victoria, would answer that call. The news of Magellan's death spread quickly through the remaining crew. Shock, grief, fear, they had followed him through storms, through unknown waters, through dangers they had never imagined, and now, their captain was gone. But the sea waited for no man, and the journey could not end here. The men knew this. They had come too far, sacrificed too much. The decision was made. Juan Sebastian Elcano, one of the surviving officers, took command of the Victoria. It was a heavy burden. Elcano was not Magellan, but he had learned from him. He had watched how Magellan led, how he inspired, how he pressed on no matter the odds. Now it was his turn to lead the men, to carry on the mission. The fleet, once 5 strong, was now reduced to 1. The Victoria stood alone on the open sea, her sails torn, her crew exhausted, but she was still seaworthy, the journey would continue. The Spice Islands, the treasure Magellan had sought for so long, were still ahead, and the crew needed those spices to make their voyage worthwhile. So, with heavy hearts, they set sail once more. The days passed, turning into weeks. The weeks stretched into months. The crew, weakened by hunger and disease, pushed forward through endless miles of ocean. The vast Pacific surrounded them, a silent companion, its waters calm yet unforgiving. Supplies dwindled. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Some of the men fell sick, others never woke up. Yet through every hardship, every loss, they sailed on. The sight of land brought both relief and danger. They reached the Spice Islands, the very goal they had set out for, but it came at a price. The islands were rich, filled with the spices they had dreamed of: cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. But the trade was not easy. Negotiations were tense. The crew, now desperate, had little room for error. But they succeeded. The ship was filled with spices, her hold heavy with the treasure they had risked everything to find. Now they had only one task left: to return home. But the return journey would be no easier than the voyage out. The vast Indian Ocean lay before them, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The Victoria sailed into the unknown once more, her crew smaller than ever, their bodies thin, their spirits weary. But they held on to one thing: hope. Hope that they would see Spain again. Hope that they would survive to tell their tale. The Indian Ocean was no kinder than the Pacific. Storms battered the ship. The wind howled through the rigging. Waves crashed against the hull, and the men clung to life as the sea tested them once more. Every day was a battle. Every moment a test of endurance. But they held on. One by one, they passed the great challenges of the sea. They rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and began their final journey up the coast. But even then, the ocean would not let them pass without cost. Sickness spread through the crew, claiming more lives. Food ran low. The ship, once full of men, now felt eerily empty. And then, after nearly 3 years at sea, the Victoria sailed into the port of Seville. It was a sight that brought tears to the eyes of the surviving crew. The familiar shores of Spain, the city they had left behind so long ago, the place they had never been sure they would see again. The Victoria, battered, worn, but victorious, had made it home. The people of Spain gathered to see the ship, marveling at her arrival. The men who stepped off her deck were hardly recognizable. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes ragged, their bodies weak from the endless journey. But they were alive. They had done it. They had completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. The news spread quickly. Ferdinand Magellan's dream had been fulfilled, though not by his own hand. His name, however, would forever be tied to this great achievement. The world had been changed by his vision, by his determination to push beyond the known, to seek out what lay beyond the horizon. He had not lived to see the journey completed, but it was his dream, his leadership, that had made it possible. For the men of the Victoria, the return was bittersweet. They had lost so much: friends, comrades, and their captain. Magellan had been their leader, the man who had inspired them to embark on this impossible voyage. But they had carried on, driven by the mission he had started. They had faced the storms, the battles, the endless miles of open ocean, and they had survived. As the crew stood before the King of Spain, they told their story, the hardships, the loss, the victories, and when they spoke of Magellan, their voices were filled with both pride and sorrow. He led us, they said. Why, he believed when no one else did. Without him, none of this would have been possible. The Victoria may have been the only ship to return, but her arrival marked the success of the greatest expedition the world had ever seen. The Earth had been circled. The map had been completed, and Ferdinand Magellan's name was etched into history. Though Magellan had perished on a distant shore, his legacy lived on. His dream had come true. The world, once vast and unknown, had been conquered. The journey, though filled with loss and suffering, had changed the course of history. And the world moved on. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan never saw the full fruits of his labor. He never tasted the spices of the islands he sought. He never stood victorious on the shores of Spain, greeted as a hero. But his name would echo through history forever. Magellan had done the impossible. He had proved that the world was not a vast, endless unknown, but something that could be circumnavigated. His journey was filled with danger, storms, mutiny, and battles, but through it all, he pressed forward. The courage it took to set sail into the unknown, to leave behind the safety of home and venture across oceans that no one had crossed before. It was more than most men could ever dream of. He wasn't just an explorer. He was a man driven by a vision. From the moment he stood as a boy at the edge of his family's land, staring at the horizon, Magellan knew he was destined for something greater. That dream had taken him across the world, through lands and seas that few had ever seen. Even in death, even as he lay on the shores of Mactan, that dream lived on. The world remembers Ferdinand Magellan not because he found the Spice Islands, but because he proved something much bigger, that the earth itself could be crossed. His voyage, the first circumnavigation of the globe, changed how people saw the world. It proved that the oceans, once thought to be endless barriers, could be navigated. It opened the door to new maps, new trade routes, and new possibilities. But for Magellan, it wasn't just about proving the world was round. It was about pushing boundaries, about seeing what lay beyond the horizon. His relentless drive to explore, to seek out the unknown, was what defined him. He had faced rejection, betrayal, and exile. Yet he never stopped believing in his mission. That is what made him different. That is what the world would remember. The voyage itself had been a long and brutal one. 5 ships had set out from Spain, filled with hope, courage, and dreams of wealth. But as the miles stretched on, as the seas grew darker and more dangerous, the cost of that dream became clear. One by one, the ships were lost. The Santiago to the rocks, the San Antonio to mutiny. By the time they reached the Spice Islands, only the Victoria remained to carry the story home. And Magellan, the man who had led them across the unknown, did not live to see it. But even though Magellan did not return, his spirit sailed with them. Every wave the Victoria crossed, every mile that brought them closer to Spain, carried the weight of Magellan's vision. It was not just the men aboard the ship who returned victorious. It was Magellan himself. The Victoria's return to Spain was a moment that changed history. She was the first ship to complete the circumnavigation of the globe. The battered and weary crew stepped onto Spanish soil, bringing with them the proof that Magellan's dream had been real, that the world was round and connected by the great oceans. It was a triumph, not just for Spain, but for all of humanity. But what of Magellan? Though he had fallen in battle, though he never saw the completion of his journey, his name lived on. His courage, his ambition, his relentless drive, these were what people remembered. He had dared to do what no one else had done before. He had led his men into the heart of the unknown and showed the world that it could be conquered. And though he never saw the shores of Spain again, His legacy was written into the very waters he had sailed. People spoke of him with awe, with admiration. Magellan, they said, the man who circled the world. His story became legend, his name whispered in the halls of kings and across the seas. Maps were drawn, new trade routes established, and explorers everywhere followed the path he had carved through the oceans. But his legacy was more than just a voyage. Magellan's story was one of human spirit, of pushing beyond what seemed possible, of refusing to give up even in the face of overwhelming odds. He taught the world that greatness does not come easily, but through perseverance, through hardship, through a willingness to take risks that others fear to take. In the years that followed, explorers would continue to sail across the oceans, charting new lands, finding new treasures. But they always remembered Magellan. His journey had paved the way. His courage had inspired them. Magellan's life was cut short on the shores of Mactan, but his journey never truly ended. It continued with the men who sailed on without him. It continued with the explorers who followed in his footsteps. And it continues even today, every time someone looks at a map, or sails across the sea, or wonders what lies beyond the horizon. In the end, Magellan's legacy is more than just a completed voyage. It is the belief that the world is not something to be feared, but something to be explored. His name will always be remembered, not just for what he accomplished, but for the spirit with which he lived his life. Ferdinand Magellan, the man who had dreamed of conquering the seas, may not have seen the fruits of his labor, but his legacy, it sailed on forever.